She stepped closer, watched my hands, and whispered, "Show me what those hands can do." Nothing was the same after that. The sun had just started to dip behind the trees when I found myself in the workshop, sharpening old garden shears that hadn't been touched in months. The air was warm and heavy with the scent of wood shavings, oil, and a hint of summer grass. A low, steady rasp filled the room as metal kissed stone, each pull of the blade releasing a soft, deliberate rhythm. It was the kind of quiet that wraps itself around you. Still, familiar, almost protective. I wasn't expecting anyone. That space behind the house had always been mine alone. But the creak of the wooden floorboard near the doorway made me pause. The shears held midair. She stood there, framed by the soft amber light pouring through the doorway like she'd stepped into a memory. She wasn't dressed up, not in the way people dress to be noticed. But she didn't have to be. There was something effortless about her. A loose linen shirt, sleeves rolled just enough to reveal the delicate veins along her wrists, hair tied loosely with a few strands catching the light like silk threads. She leaned against the doorframe, arms folded lightly, and said, "You really know what you're doing with those hands." Not flirtatious, not serious either. Just enough warmth in her tone to make my chest tighten. I swallowed before I could answer. "Tools behave if you treat them right," I said, trying to sound casual, though I could hear the slight roughness in my own voice. She stepped in, slowly, like someone who wasn't sure whether they were interrupting or being invited. The wooden floor groaned beneath her, the sound small but somehow louder than everything else. She moved closer to the workbench, and I caught a faint trace of her perfume. Not sweet, but clean, grounded, like citrus and sun-warmed skin. Her eyes weren't fixed on the tools. They were on my hands. Not in an obvious way, but I felt it, that quiet, searching attention that makes you aware of yourself in ways you hadn't been a second ago. My hands suddenly felt heavier, every movement more deliberate. The whetstone's rasp against the metal sounded slower, steadier, as if the night itself had leaned in to listen. "You fix everything around here, don't you?" she asked. Her voice carried that soft maturity, calm, textured by the kind of life you only earn through time. "Only what I can," I replied. She smiled, not with her mouth but with her eyes. It wasn't a wide grin. It was something quieter, smaller, like a spark she didn't intend to share but couldn't quite keep to herself. The world outside was still. Crickets hadn't started yet. The breeze hadn't picked up. Just two people in a space that wasn't supposed to feel charged, but somehow did. I don't know if it was the way the light touched her hair or the way she watched me like she saw more than just tools and hands. But in that moment, the workshop, my workshop, didn't feel like just mine anymore. Building soft comfort through shared space, ordinary gestures, and a growing pull that neither names allowed. The next evening, the workshop wasn't as quiet. Or maybe it was just me who noticed the difference, the way the air seemed to wait for something. I was sanding the handle of an old spade, the sun bleeding orange across the tree-line, when I heard the soft crunch of her footsteps on the gravel path. I didn't look up right away. I didn't have to. I'd already memorized the rhythm of that walk the night before. "Back at it again," she said, her voice carrying that easy, steady warmth. I let out a low laugh. "These tools don't fix themselves." She walked inside like she'd always belonged there. No hesitation this time. The hanging bulb above the workbench flickered softly, and the faint hum of evening cicadas filled the silence between words. She leaned against the bench opposite me, close enough for me to catch that familiar hint of her perfume again. Something clean and warm, like citrus caught in sunlight. "What are you working on today?" she asked, tucking a loose strand of hair behind her ear. I held up the spade handle. "This one's cracked down the middle. Needs sanding and oiling. Old wood. It just needs a little patience." She smiled like she understood more than what I said. "I used to help my dad with tools like these," she murmured. "Hated it then. I think I'd like it now." I handed her a small file, not because I needed the help, but because something about the thought of her hands working beside mine felt right. "Here," I said. "Try it." She took the file carefully, like it was something fragile. Her fingers brushed against mine for half a second, warm, soft, grounding. It wasn't a deliberate touch, but it left a small, quiet echo between us. She positioned the file clumsily at first, and I leaned in slightly, just close enough to guide her hand without actually touching. "Not like that," I said softly. "Angle it a little lower. Let the tool do the work." She tilted it, followed my instruction, and the rasping sound of metal on wood filled the workshop. I could see the way her face softened, focused, a little amused. She wasn't pretending to be interested. She actually was. The workshop light cast warm shadows on her face, highlighting the small lines near her eyes when she smiled. Lines that spoke of a life fully lived, of laughter that had shaped her instead of hardening her. There was something grounding about it, something I hadn't realized I craved until that moment. "Not bad," I said quietly. She looked up at me, proud in the smallest, most unguarded way. Well, I had a good teacher. The silence that followed wasn't heavy. It was full, like the air itself carried everything we weren't saying. Outside, the sky deepened into a soft blue, and the scent of rain lingered far away on the wind. I noticed how close we were now, close enough that if I shifted, our shoulders might touch. Close enough that even the small movements between us felt deliberate. Neither of us moved back. The moment where shared warmth turns into something charged. Not through confession, but through silence, nearness, and everything left unsaid. The third night felt different before it even began. The air outside was cooler, thick with the scent of rain that hadn't quite arrived. I had the workshop doors propped open, letting the late summer breeze slide in, carrying with it the faint sounds of crickets and distant dogs. I wasn't sharpening anything this time, just rearranging a few tools, sanding a piece of wood for no real reason other than to keep my hands busy. I told myself it didn't matter whether she came by or not, but when the familiar crunch of gravel reached my ears, I stopped pretending. She walked in wearing a loose, soft cardigan over a simple tank top, hair down this time, falling against her shoulders in waves. The way the light from the hanging bulb framed her made her look softer than usual, less guarded, like the night itself was coaxing her closer. "You really don't take nights off, do you?" she said, her voice quieter than usual, like even she felt the weight of the stillness around us. "Maybe I just like the company," I replied without thinking. The words hung between us, quiet, undeniable. She didn't tease me for it. She just looked at me for a second longer than people normally do, and that was enough to shift everything. She walked over to the workbench where the shears from the first night sat, clean now, polished. She picked them up, traced her fingers along the cool metal. "Show me how you do it again," she said softly. "I didn't really get it right last time." I set down what I was holding and stepped behind her, close enough that I could feel the faint warmth radiating from her back. My hand hovered near hers, not touching yet. "You want a clean angle?" I murmured, my voice lower than usual, almost caught in my throat. "Let it glide. Don't force it." She adjusted her grip on the handle, and as she leaned forward, the curve of her shoulder brushed against my chest. Not fully, just enough to make my breath falter. She didn't step away. I lifted my hand slowly, guiding hers, not holding it, just aligning it. Her knuckles brushed mine. Her pulse fluttered against the base of her thumb. Her hair carried a faint scent of warm citrus and something softer beneath it. Something distinctly her. Outside, a wind picked up, rattling the trees. But inside the workshop, it felt like the world had stilled around that single touch. Her voice came quiet, almost a whisper. "Like this." I leaned just a little closer, enough for my breath to warm the side of her neck. "Yeah," I whispered back. "Exactly like that." Neither of us moved for a long moment. The blade, the handle, the bench, all of it faded. All that existed was the quiet pulse of the space between us. Her hand trembled slightly, but she didn't pull away. I didn't either. If a line existed, this was the closest we'd ever come to crossing it. And it didn't feel wrong. It felt inevitable. The weight of what just happened sinks in. Vulnerability surfaces, cloaked in humor, half-truths, and a quiet fear neither wants to fully name. The night air was heavier after that moment. Neither of us said it, but something had shifted, subtly but undeniably. The workshop, once a place where the world felt simple, suddenly carried too much silence. Not the easy kind from the first nights. A charged silence, stretched thin between what we'd felt and what we were both afraid to admit. She stepped back first. Not abruptly, just slowly, as though she needed space to breathe again. Her fingers lingered on the tool for half a heartbeat longer before she set it down gently on the workbench. "Well?" she said with a soft laugh, one that didn't quite reach her eyes. "I think that's enough learning for one night." It should have sounded light, but I heard the tremor beneath it, the quiet ache of someone who spent years building careful walls and had just felt one shift out of place. I cleared my throat, searching for words that wouldn't make everything more complicated. "You're a fast learner," I managed, my voice lower than I intended. She brushed a strand of hair behind her ear, a small, nervous habit I hadn't seen from her before. "Yeah, well, you've got dangerous hands," she said softly, almost like she was testing the weight of her own words. The flickering bulb above us threw warm, uneven light across her face, highlighting the faint lines around her eyes, the kind that come from living, really living. She looked both composed and entirely unguarded at the same time. "I'm serious," she added after a pause. You shouldn't look at people the way you do." I tilted my head. "How do I look at people?" Her eyes flicked toward mine and away again. "Like they matter. Like you don't even realize what it does." There was no teasing in her voice anymore. Just honesty, the kind that lands gently but hits deep. A breeze slipped through the open door, carrying the soft scent of damp earth. The shears on the workbench gleamed faintly, still warm from the touch of our hands. "You know there's a difference between us?" she said finally, her tone steady but her hands betraying her, fingers twisting lightly around the hem of her cardigan. "And not just the obvious one." I didn't answer right away. I could have said a dozen things, reassured her, downplayed it, stepped back to make it easier. But all I could think about was how close she'd been, the feel of her hand against mine, and how none of it had felt wrong. "Yeah," I said quietly. "I know." Her shoulders softened just slightly at that. Not in relief, but in recognition. She gave me a small, tired smile, the kind that says you shouldn't want this, but you do anyway. And just like that, she turned toward the door, stopping only long enough to rest her hand on the frame. "Good night," she whispered, not quite meeting my eyes. "Good night," I said back, but it felt like more than a simple word. When she left, the workshop felt too big. The silence was no longer steady. It was restless, like the air itself remembered her warmth and didn't quite know what to do without it. One small, wordless act carries more weight than a speech. Fear and hesitation don't disappear, but something stronger begins to grow underneath them. The next day passed slower than usual. I tried to busy myself, oiling hinges, fixing a loose step on the porch, sorting screws into jars I didn't even need sorted. But every task had an edge of restlessness to it. The memory of her hand brushing mine, the soft catch in her laugh, the way her eyes faltered before she left. It all kept looping in my head like a quiet echo. By the time the sun dipped low, I found myself back in the workshop without meaning to. The bulb above the bench flickered to life as I pulled the cord, casting its familiar amber glow across the tools. It didn't feel empty tonight. It felt like a place holding its breath. I wasn't sure she'd come. Part of me hoped she wouldn't. A bigger part of me hoped she would. And then, just like the first night, the faint sound of footsteps on gravel reached the doorway. She paused there for a moment, hands tucked loosely into her cardigan pockets, eyes steady but unsure. She wasn't pretending this time. We both knew something had changed. "I shouldn't be here," she said softly. Not a warning, more like a confession. I didn't step closer, but I didn't step back either. "And yet you are." That made her laugh, just barely. She walked in slower than usual, and for the first time, she didn't fill the silence with small talk. She just stood near the workbench, letting the quiet hold its own weight. "I've spent a long time learning how not to do stupid things," she said after a while, tracing her fingers along the edge of the table. "But then you go and make everything feel simple." I swallowed, my throat tight with everything I wanted to say and didn't trust myself to. She turned, and for a second it felt like we were standing in the same quiet place as before. But this time, no pretense, no safe distance. She shifted as if to leave. I don't know what made me do it. Instinct, fear of watching her walk out again, or something deeper. My hand moved before my mind caught up. "Wait," I said, my voice low. My fingers brushed against her wrist. Soft, deliberate, barely enough pressure to hold her but enough to make her stop. The warmth of her skin met mine, and in that instant, everything else. The tools, the air, the age between us, the hesitations, blurred into the background. She didn't pull away. Her eyes flicked down at my hand, then back up at me. There was a storm in them, but not the kind that pushes people apart. The kind that asks, "Are you sure?" I didn't say yes. I didn't need to. She took a small step closer. Not a full embrace, not a declaration. Just a breath shared too close, the space between us thinning until it felt like something fragile could finally break. Her pulse fluttered beneath my thumb. Mine wasn't much steadier. For the first time, neither of us reached for the safety of words. We just stayed there, suspended in the quiet, in the touch, in the choice neither of us could take back. It wasn't a promise, but it was a beginning. This is where the tension peaks, not in grand declarations, but in quiet acceptance. Proximity becomes its own language, and neither of them hides anymore. The night was soft, one of those rare evenings when the air seemed to settle instead of move. Outside, a low chorus of crickets threaded through the silence. Inside the workshop, the warm amber light cast shadows that stretched long across the floor, wrapping the room in a kind of stillness that didn't demand anything. It simply existed. She stood near the doorway, cardigan sleeves pushed to her elbows, hair loose and slightly tousled by the breeze. I was sitting on the steps just outside the workshop, elbows resting loosely on my knees. For once, the tools lay untouched on the bench behind me. Neither of us needed them as an excuse anymore. For a moment, we didn't speak, and it didn't feel like silence was a wall between us. It felt like the thing that finally let us breathe. She walked over slowly, not because she was unsure, but because the night itself seemed to move that way. Her bare feet whispered against the wooden floorboards. When she reached me, she didn't ask to sit. She just lowered herself beside me, shoulder brushing mine as naturally as breath. The closeness felt different now. There was no accidental touch, no careful holding back. Her body leaned into mine like it had wanted to for a while but had finally stopped asking for permission. "You're quiet tonight," she murmured, turning her face slightly toward me. I smiled faintly, eyes on the night sky. "Feels like the kind of night that doesn't need words." She hummed softly, that low, thoughtful sound people make when they don't want to break a moment but can't help acknowledging it. I could feel the warmth of her arm against mine, the soft fabric of her cardigan brushing my skin. She tilted her head back, letting the breeze catch her hair, and a few strands fell against my shoulder. I didn't move them away. "I wasn't supposed to get this close," she whispered. It wasn't a warning this time, more like a truth she'd already accepted. I turned my head, and for the first time she didn't look away. Her eyes held mine, steady, soft, with something raw flickering behind them. For all the quiet strength she carried, I could see it then. The part of her that had built walls for a reason. The part that, somehow, I'd been allowed to step past. Slowly, I lifted my hand, not to claim anything, just to offer. My fingers found hers, resting lightly at first, like a question. She answered without words, curling her fingers between mine, letting the spaces fill. The night blurred a little around us. The world became the creak of the steps beneath our weight, the faint chirp of insects, the warmth of her hand against mine. She leaned her head against my shoulder, and the simple weight of it made something inside me settle, something that hadn't even realized it was restless. "You shouldn't make it feel this easy," she whispered, voice small but certain. I exhaled slowly, the corners of my mouth lifting. "Then stop coming here," I said softly. She let out a quiet laugh, the sound brushing against my skin like the night air. "I don't think I can. We didn't kiss. We didn't need to. The way she stayed leaned into me, the way her hand held mine like a quiet promise. That was more intimate than any touch we'd ever shared. The boundary between hesitation and desire didn't vanish. It just stopped mattering. The air has softened. What once felt forbidden now feels inevitable. This is where they stop pretending that the bond between them is temporary, where something quiet but real takes root. The first light of dawn was thin and gold, slipping through the trees like it wasn't supposed to be seen yet. I sat on the same steps where we'd spent the night, or what was left of it. My hands loosely folded, shoulders wrapped in the cool weight of the morning. The workshop behind me smelled faintly of cedar, oil, and something warmer I couldn't quite name. She stepped out slowly, mug in hand, wearing a soft gray sweater that hung loose around her frame. Her hair was slightly messy, not in the deliberate way people make it look, but in the honest way the night leaves its mark. When our eyes met, there wasn't a single word between us. We didn't need any. She walked over to where I was sitting, careful like she didn't want to break the stillness of the moment. But the truth was, she wasn't a disruption anymore. She was part of it. "Coffee," she said softly, holding out the mug. I took it, fingers brushing against hers. Even that light touch held a weight now. Not the uncertain electricity of the first accidental brush, but something settled. Something we both knew we'd chosen. "You didn't sleep," she murmured. I shook my head with a small smile. "Didn't want to miss this." She looked out toward the horizon, where the sky was still deciding what color it wanted to be. Her shoulders rose and fell with a quiet breath, and for a moment she seemed almost younger, or maybe it was just that she wasn't holding anything back anymore. "This wasn't supposed to happen," she said finally. It wasn't regret. It was an acknowledgement of the line we'd both crossed long before either of us said it out loud. "I know." My voice came out low, steady. "But it did." Her eyes flicked to me, soft, cautious, but with a spark I recognized. The same spark that had lived quietly between us since that first night. She lowered herself onto the step beside me, close enough that our knees touched. No hesitation this time, just the quiet acceptance of shared space. "People will talk," she whispered, almost like she was testing the words. "Let them," I replied, and the honesty in my voice surprised even me. Not loud, not defiant, just sure. For a long stretch of silence, we watched the sky warm itself. Her hand drifted down between us, resting lightly on the wood, palm up, a wordless offering. I didn't rush. I just let my fingers find hers, slow and deliberate, weaving through them like I'd been waiting all along. The wind shifted, carrying the scent of damp earth and wood shavings. She leaned in, resting her head lightly against my shoulder. That simple gesture, familiar now, carried the weight of everything we'd built without needing to name it. "Tell me this isn't a mistake," she whispered. I turned my head slightly, close enough to feel her breath, close enough that the morning light caught the small lines near her eyes. Not flaws, but the quiet stories of a life she'd lived long before I stepped into it. "It's not," I said quietly. "It's us." She didn't answer. She didn't have to. Her fingers tightened around mine. Her body settled against me, and the sun finally broke through the trees, warm and unashamed. There was no grand confession, no fireworks, just a choice, simple, steady, and real. And in that quiet, I knew it wasn't about falling fast. It was about finding something that felt like it had always been waiting for the right time. "Let them," I replied, and the honesty in my voice surprised even me. Not loud, not defiant, just sure. For a long stretch of silence, we watched the sky warm itself. Her hand drifted down between us, resting lightly on the wood, palm up, a wordless offering. I didn't rush. I just let my fingers find hers, slow and deliberate, weaving through them like I'd been waiting all along. The wind shifted, carrying the scent of damp earth and wood shavings. She leaned in, resting her head lightly against my shoulder. That simple gesture, familiar now, carried the weight of everything we'd built without needing to name it. "Tell me this isn't a mistake," she whispered. I turned my head slightly, close enough to feel her breath, close enough that the morning light caught the small lines near her eyes. Not flaws, but the quiet stories of a life she'd lived long before I stepped into it. It's not, I said quietly. It's us.